Well, welcome to this, what I hope will be an interesting meeting. It's under the banner of the AIA, the Association of the Retired Staff, and it's part of a series that we have initiated. We started with the idea that the crisis we're in is a crisis of progress, a more profound crisis than simply a point in the economic cycle from which we are now sort of emerging, but the big problems are still there. And in that sense, we think that that initial starting point was right. We are in a crisis of progress. And of course, it's easy to understand why, in such a situation, we should be interested in the future of Europe. I mean, some of us, I did, joined the OEC when it was a European organization. And we still have that strong feeling about Europe and its place in the world. A particular point I would like to make at the beginning is that today we have invited several youth organizations, European youth organizations, and of course, we think, the retired staff, that's essential to have the young people involved in this discussion, because they will, as it were, be carrying the can. And their views on this future of Europe are essential. The last meeting we had on this in this series was on a world fit for the rising generation. We tried to look at the problems of youth and their position in the global system. We have a bit of an inclination to think of the present scene as not only the relationship of the market to states, but also to what I call youth power, people power. It strikes me that in the very complex political debate that's going on, people power is a very important factor. And of course, we've seen the proof of that recently as far as women are concerned, haven't we? Not half. And unless we get things reasonably right, the same will be true of youth. Anyway, they're here today, two organizations, I can't see from this stage, but one is... NDG. Yes, that's the European Association of Students, and whereas LEAP is the European Laboratory of Political Forecasting. And I take this occasion of paying a tribute to Franck Biancheri, because I looked him up this morning on the computer, and I found that he was considered by Time as one of the 20 heroes of European Union. So I think it's relevant to pay a tribute to him. I tried very hard to get Jacques Delors to come, but he's very ill and he couldn't make it, but he's aware of this meeting. Jacques Delors actually worked with us. When was it? When he was at Dauphine. He was a consultant and he worked with us a lot, and I knew him very well. So it would have been great to have had him here and to pay a tribute to him. So as I mentioned, we in the AIA had this seminar a short while ago on the world fit for the rising generation. The two things are linked. And I would be prepared to say that, in my view anyway, this world we're moving into will be better off if Europe, I'm not only talking about the European Union, I'm talking about Europe as an entity. It will still be an entity of some sort, even if after the Brexit. It'll still be Europe. And the United Kingdom will still have a place, not necessarily in the European Union, but in the system that is developing. And what is it? What is it that this European entity can play in the global system in the years to come? I put it, I'm probably a bit naive actually, but here it goes. There's a book out, just come out, it's written by a Norwegian, not yet translated, and the title is The Renaissance of the Enlightenment. The Renaissance of the Enlightenment. And I would like to think that Europe, in what form it's going to take, will play a hand in that recovery of the idea of progress. Of course, it won't be the sort of progress that we have seen, and it will involve other great civilizations in the effort. And personally, I think we could refer to it as the invention of a new humanism. And a new humanism that draws also on these other great civilizations that will be powerful actors in the world to come. Okay, that having been said, let me just welcome our speakers. We've got Sergio here. Well, Sergio has retired from the OECD. He was director of the Center for Entrepreneurship. I've discovered that he's a bit of a political entrepreneur. I hadn't realized that his past history leads him today into making this presentation. And so Sergio is going to kick off, but before he does, just make a reference to Anthony Gooch there, who is Director of Public Affairs and Communication. One of the interesting things about him is that he runs, and very creatively, I think, the OECD Forum each year before the ministers get down to working. He opens the doors and the windows of the OECD, not only to different groups in the civic society, but also to ideas, lots of new ideas. Anything you can think of that's a bit radical, somewhere or other you can find it in the agenda of the forum. And let me just mention that I'm preparing a paper for a new discussion on capitalism, and I remember that in the forum there was several characters dealing with the issue of post-capitalism, and anyway, they're all figuring in this paper I'm doing, so you'll see. Okay, so I think that is all I have to say, and Sergio, why don't you kick off? It may be a good idea. There are two things in Sergio's paper. One is the diagnostic, and he's pretty rough and rigorous, but he also has a perspective to present, a vision, and I think he wants to start off with the first part, which is the diagnosis, and then we'll see how we get on. Sergio, off you go.
Thank you, Ron. Good morning, everyone. I would like to focus on just two issues. I think that there is a need for reforms of the European Union, an urgent need, because there is an election of the European Parliament in mid next year, and the new Commission that has to be elected. And so in 1 year time and even earlier, the preparation for that political game will start. And then there is something, and for that it's important to have a much clearer vision of the governance structure of the European Union, which is today rather complex and confusing. And also in early May, the European Commission will present its proposals for the new budgetary planning for the after 2020. And that is a big challenge. And therefore, I will focus on just these two things. That what we see that since 1992, since the Maastricht Treaty, Europe, what we have seen is a differentiated Europe that has emerged. It's a Europe with two standards. One is the communitarian method of majority vote that oversees, governs the common market, has enshrined into the Single Market Act of 1986. And the second is which is governed through majority vote. Then there is the intergovernmental evolution that emerged from the Maastricht that implies a unanimity vote. And to govern the new strategic issues called the pillars, the external and security policy, the Eurozone, the European Economic and Monetary Union, and the justice and home affairs. So these are intergovernmental, parallel to the other. All the problems, the crises that we are talking about concern this intergovernmental approach governed by unanimity vote. I think that what we are facing today is a mismatch between what is rationally needed and what is politically doable. I don't think that is politically doable a new treaty. This is why I think that we have to work with the existing, the reform should be enacted within the current legal framework, which allows qualified majority vote for enhanced cooperation. I think that a differentiated Europe will stay there, and but a differentiated Europe, if not structured, it could generate a proliferation of international treaties among a coalition of the willing states that will be the perfect recipe to increase the complexity and accelerate disintegration. This is why I think the three reasonable working hypotheses are one of differentiated circles. A first circle of the Eurozone, and now we have seen the discussions in Germany between Merkel and Schulz that have agreed on the creation of the European Monetary Fund, possibly also European Banking Union, that goes into that first circle. Then a second circle of the European community based on the four freedom of movements: goods, services, persons, and capital. And the third circle of continental partnership on dealing with external trade that will involve also countries like UK, Switzerland, and so on. So that's the third circle. And for such an asymmetric union, there is no need for changes in the treaty. I think that is a fundamental point. Second, the budget. The EU has different phases and roles, but almost a single delivery tool, the EU budget. Now, as a general rule, the EU should intervene in its action when it is more efficient than the single individual states. European value added, proportionality and subsidiarity are still the three leading guiding lines for EU spending. But the financial resources are capped to 1.23% of the gross national income, and it's unlikely that would be increased. The departure of the UK, a net contributor to the EU budget, for about 10 to 13 billion euros annually, it varies from year to year, will oblige member states to take decisions very soon after the presentation of the proposed budget in May. If member states are serious in addressing new challenges, such as youth employment, embracing the digital revolution and making Europe more innovative and more entrepreneurial, address border control and migration management, social inclusion and reduction of inequalities, climate change, security and defense, supplementary resources are needed. As the EU cannot finance itself with loans, the new policies should be financed either with fresh money, with the new EU tax, or by discontinuing the EU policies with less value added or with a weak output. And the first candidates for this exercise are the two largest spending policies in the EU budget, the common agricultural policy and the cohesion policy. As part two budget or voluntary part of the OECD budget is based, has in the EU an important, significant contributor, I think that what is going on in Brussels may have repercussions also in this House, and this is why I think that it's good to understand what is going on and discuss it. That's it.
So, Sergio, incidentally, if you want to speak, those that have got pancards could raise them, and those that haven't could raise their hands. Anthony, would you like to come in at this stage and have your comments on Sergio? Sergio has put his emphasis on what we might call the European crisis. And I think we could have a discussion on that, and then we could perhaps go to the second part of his paper, which is the project for the future, and discuss that. And I'd like to repeat that I hope that the young people here at the end will get in on the debate and especially have their views on what they would like to see in the future. So, Anthony, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Ron and Sergio, for the invitation. It's both pleasurable and also it's great to connect up with, I was counting around the table, a good 10 colleagues who were very active in this organization when I joined, and some of whom have moved on recently, and I think you should probably rename yourselves Forever Young. I think your name may not do you justice in the sense of what you're able to bring, which is convening power, and also I commend you for bringing together representatives from LEAP and AGE, who I'm meeting for the first time. The Jacques Delors Institute I'm a lot more familiar with. Now, I think you invited me here so that I could try and inject a little bit of the radical and provocative to the discussion. And so do take what I say in that spirit. Ron, you'll be pleased to hear that the word of the year this year is youthquake, what you were saying earlier on. So if you're thinking about that issue around youth power and people power, it's something that I think has really come through. And I prefer that word to the previous Oxford Dictionary word of the year, which was post-truth, for the reasons that you can imagine. That makes the job of an organization like the OECD and our job particularly challenging, and I'm sure for many of you around this table as well. What I wanted to do is first off commend you for the starting point, which is to the reinvention of the concept and the notion of progress. It's something that I think we're devoting and have devoted a certain amount of time to in recent years here. And in what I can speak to, which is since 2008, I think that the events of 2008 certainly prodded this organization to question many things, but also to be reimagining and recasting as it's always done, but with a greater urgency. And what occurred in 2016, which this is a personal view, was the political equivalent of 2008 in the political sphere. That only obliges us in a way to double down. But it does also show the degree to which we suffer from a temporality problem, whether that is the EU or whether it's the OECD, and that is the time it takes for those good ideas to actually make their way to become policy, and many don't, and then for the policy to make its way to actually being felt by the lives. So you see better policies for better lives out there. It's not just a fun slogan. It's because our goal, whether that is in the European context, whether it is in a context like this one, is to try and deliver on that. Some thoughts regarding the what I think is also a very transformed environment to the one where the European Union itself was born, and I would say I'm probably a hybrid I was born in 1968, 10 years into EU. Origins definitely European and complex, as you can imagine, from my accent, given the current circumstances. But I worked for the European Union, for the European Commission for 13 years, remain very connected with many people involved there. And child probably of single market times, the 1980s. The single market was established in 85. And then when I was starting to look in more detail, probably as of the late 80s and early 90s, when I became exposed to the European institutions for the first time. I was a fly on the wall in the Maastricht negotiations when many ministers were establishing what the Maastricht criteria would be. And I was, with hindsight, surprised to see what an important voice the finance minister of the United Kingdom at the time had in the formulation of those rules, when that country had explicitly said that it would not be part of that undertaking. But it needed to give its approval, and it also demanded to have a voice and vote in the formulation of that. And if we think to what happened subsequently, I think that provides food for thought. I think we need to factor in certain elements as we move forward in reimagining progress, but also imagining the future of Europe. We're in the midst, I think, of redefinitions of what constitutes the economy. There are terms that are used now, and I don't think they're necessarily new terms in human history, but notions around shared economy that call into question traditional concepts around what constitutes ownership and the degree to which it's important to own something outright, as opposed to be able to enjoy the benefits of something. That connects us into questions around definitions of intellectual property, which are a very Western concept. It's a concept that the European Union itself has done a great deal to establish around the European Union itself, but also impinge on globally. Concepts around what constitutes work. I remember in forms the term occupation was used. And for me, semantically, occupation and work are distinct things. Something that keeps you occupied, but also that allows you to be able to make a contribution. And the notions around work that connote a financial transaction, that you will do, you will be paid for a day's work. To what degree is the European space entering into certain elements that we could term to be post-consumerists? If we look at the security challenges that you cite around climate, around food, there we are clearly looking at behavioral change that has increased exponentially, how we view resources, and working back from that, what type of economy, what type of society we are actually interested in. And I think in that respect, millennials, perhaps some of whom I'm sitting opposite, their views on what they are looking for from society might be quite different to the views of my peers when I emerged from a pretty privileged academic process in the 1980s where, and I still don't understand it to this day, so many of my peers went into three areas of societal activity. And this is from an elite university: management consultancy, investment banking, and commercial law. That was where the so-called intellectual cream of countries was gravitating. And if we think about the societal good of those activities, it poses questions. I also think we need to dwell on the political geography of discontent. And I say this because I know that both Ron and Sergio have spent a lot of time on these questions in their careers and continue to deliberate on them. The regional policies of the EU are a great example, actually, a really clever example, perhaps before their time. There are people waking up to the fact that they will no longer enjoy them, and that's what it's taken in order for people to understand the value that they had. But concepts like that, they may have been before their time at a certain point. Where might they lie in the future? But that geography of discontent is not just economic, it's political. And I'm going to come back to that because I think we also have afoot, and if we're thinking about casting forward for Europe, we should not underestimate the psychological crisis. And it's a psychological crisis that is very connected in with values, with societal bonds, or the lack of those societal bonds, with issues around identity and purpose. Many of you may be familiar with the tapestries that coal miners, when they demonstrated, and I as a young man, the coal miners' strike in the United Kingdom stayed very prominently with me, and I remember these marches. And on those banners is the history of industries, but it's the history of people. Where has much of that history gone, or what replaces it? What are the narratives, and what are the things that give people that sense of purpose and status and contribution? And I don't want to idealize what being a coal miner was like, and dying of lung cancer and many other things, or in a coal shaft. But the idea that you actually kept the lights on in a country, or that incredible ship that was sailing around the seas was something that you made, and equivalence thereof, that sense of purpose is one that we need to look at very carefully. But we need to look at it very carefully in the knowledge that we need to manage demographies that are changing a great deal. And Sergio, you put your finger on the phenomenon that we know well, but that we're struggling with around aging societies. But there's something deeper for me, and that is that we also have a demographic shift which impacts in many ways. There are, and you are excellent examples, but I think that you're interesting examples. You are going to be with us for a long period of time. I will be around, all being well, for a long period of time, but far longer perhaps than your predecessors. What does that mean? That the proportion of populations that are older is going to grow exponentially. We now have something explicitly called the fourth age. So the third age is, and was, the fourth age. What that means is that we need to place far more emphasis, and at a European level, thinking about this sort of stuff, and as OECD, on what does that mean in terms of adapting and accompanying. We're getting our head around lifelong learning, but imagine the challenge that brings also in terms of bringing people along, but in a far more intense way, in the sense of really thinking about what that means. And I remember spending time with people who were working on startups in Amsterdam to bring them to the OECD Forum and saying to them, look, spend at least 20-25% of your creative energy thinking about how you're going to bring people along who aren't digital natives like you, who haven't grown up with a certain number of elements, because worst case scenario, they can derail you, but best case, because it's an obligation that you have, which is connected with that notion of intergenerational solidarity. And that issue of democratic shift and older populations who are going to be present for longer, we know that older populations are far more politically active in the political systems that we have today, proportions of voting. And we also have a crisis in our politics with our democracies. I lived the Brexit process very closely, and I would argue that it was the first truly democratic process that the United Kingdom had lived for a long time. Why? Because for the first time, in my living memory, one man, one woman did equal one vote. The political system in the United Kingdom is a first-past-the-post system, in which there is no proportional representation. If in a constituency 500,000 people vote for one MP and 499,999 vote for another, the 499,999 have no voice. That's probably reflected when people say, well, we won by 52, that's it. Winner takes all, because it's a projection of that mindset. So as we chart forward as well in terms of future of Europe, what type of democratic evolutions do we need to see so that what is developed and created could be considered to be far more representative over time? Quick also, and this is going to be very provocative, I have a big question about the nation-state itself. And I know this is difficult. I work for the European Union based on nation-states. I'm working in an intergovernmental organization, the OECD. And yet I'm wondering, and when Sergio said, well, the budget is constructed on the basis that the EU should intervene only where the nation-state can't manage, and I'm just wondering if it's self-censorship now. which is, can we make the assumption that the nation state can't manage? Because the major issues around youth employment, digital, migration management, social inclusion, reduction of inequalities, security and defense, that can be done at the level of a nation state if you're not America or China or India. I know my view on that, but we have to pay due homage to the nation state, and I wonder if that's not a problem. You link it to what Danny Roderick said a few years ago, the trilemma about the coexistence between that and forces of globalization that were unleashed a long time ago, and we have questions there to ask. I have a bit of an issue with your dates when you talk about the de facto to Europe, because I think that the EU was born with that from its origin. That was the tension between two Frenchmen, Jean Monnet and Charles de Gaulle, and that was never resolved at the time, and that coexistence has always been with us. Supranational was born with a customs union. Supranational was born with a common external tariff. And that is also something where, when you said that there could be a third basket of common trade policy, the former trade negotiator in me can tell you that one of the problems the United Kingdom has is it isn't going to be able to have its cake and eat it on trade. So it's going to lose the benefits of over 50, 55 preferential trading arrangements that the EU has developed on behalf of all of its member countries, because you cannot be inside that and not be part of the supranational. It is Europe that negotiates on behalf of all of its countries, which gives it that power to say to China, we're 500 million people. Are you listening? And if they don't, the EU can leave. And if the EU leaves, China says, we now understand who you are and what you represent. And that's a personal experience I lived working alongside the EU Trade Commissioner, who was instrumental in bringing China into the World Trade Organization. On a positive note as well, I'd like to say that Brexit, I think, can play a really important role in getting the general public in many parts of Europe to understand the value of the European Union. It can play a super important role to see this experiment being played out before their very eyes, to see what it is that people are in danger of losing, what it is that they have taken for granted and they didn't realize and they didn't know. It's such a shame that it's happening in this case, but if there's a silver lining, is it that people can sort of, you don't know what you had until you don't have it anymore. Okay, there's 27 who aren't walking out. You can see what you wouldn't have if that were the case by looking at this process. When we talk about the reform of governance, I also wonder if in the conversations that we would have in these types of settings, we're quite elite. We're people like us. You know, we can count the number of languages that we speak, the privileged educations that we have benefited from. And how representative are we of many of the people who might be expressing themselves in a manner that we don't particularly find palatable right now, but who may feel that they've come to the end of a road. It's sort of 25 years of gas building up in a room, and where some of you may recall a gentleman called Ross Perot in the early 1990s. I don't think that his campaign was very different to that of Donald Trump. I mean, I think it was a lot more salubrious in the case of Ross Perot. But the underlying message was similar. The difference is that when Donald Trump lights a match in the room, 25 years later, the room explodes. And that begs many questions of what occurred in that period of time and what we might need to do about it. But if we think now about what casting into the future, how do we harness collective intelligence? Are we in a period where we're maybe indulging in a certain degree of collective stupidity? So post-truth, the ability for everyone to express their views, virality of all of the salacious stuff which human beings tend to gravitate around. But could we get through that turbulent period, fingers crossed, without wars and stuff, and actually get into a more of a world that we might want? And when I say that, how many of you are familiar with the World We Want campaign that the United Nations ran in order to be able to develop the Sustainable Development Goals? But they ran it in about 90 countries, and they asked people what they thought was most important to them. It's a little bit similar, you know, in philosophy, the Better Life Index of the OECD. It's asking people what they're interested in and what they want. And I think that would be something that we could look at. Almost done. I have some questions for you regarding what your reaction to what's happened regionally or in nations or those that aspire to be nations recently, because there's sort of an underlying assumption in the paper that we're looking at the intergovernmental, we're looking at the community method, but what about, you know, what's happened in referenda where Scotland wasn't far away from voting to leave the United Kingdom, although Scotland wanted to be part of the EU, and now it's a horrible situation for them because they're locked in the UK and yet they voted to stay in the EU. The events in Catalonia that have brought out some very polarized positions now. We've had representatives from Corsica spending a lot of time in Paris recently, and I don't need to tell you about Lombardy. You know that better than anybody else. Those are just some examples. Thank you.
Wow. You mentioned that you were born in 1968. It so happens that this venerable institution in 1968 invited delegations from all the member countries for a discussion about what 1968 meant. It's quite remarkable that this organization could do that. And what came out of it, I managed that particular exercise, which is highly dicey, as we might say. What came out of it is relevant today, because what they had to say basically was, we don't want to be looked upon as instruments for the economy. We want to create the economy. And the very interesting thing is today, with the new production, the new technologies, the new production system, the new ideas about organization, I think we're moving into a period when, first of all, enterprises will be considered as part of the good life, not just something to be worked with to get some money, but part of the good life. And we had a seminar here with Edmund Phelps in which he made that point. And a lot of what you had to say, there's another reflection I'd like to make before Sergio makes some comments. We're already in what we could call a polycentric world system. It's not a multipolar system. It's not a superpower. In this polycentric system, what you called and I called people power is one of the very important forces in the field. It's already there, a polycentric system, and the polycentric system includes the civic society, includes the multinationals, a very more complex system, but a more open one. So that's I happen, incidentally, to have spent a year in the United States in Trump territory, where I learned to be a pilot during the war. And I can tell you that these populations, it's easy to understand the geography of discontent. They're good people, they're nice people, but they're fed up. And the same is true of the north of England, who voted heavily for the Brexit. I was born and bred there, and I understand what's going on. Okay, so Sergio, wouldn't it be a good idea if you react to that? And then we throw the floor open, and I invite you, all of you, to have your say, because we've got a very rich menu there from Anthony.
Well, Anthony indeed has put a lot of food for thought on the table. I think that I haven't touched on the political geography of discontent, because this has so many dimensions and it's extremely difficult. What I saw, for instance, that in my own country, 42% of the voters are over 55. The voters under 35 are barely 20%. So this has resulted over the last 20 years in policies against the youth, in favor of the elder. There have been two reforms, pension reforms, that all the weight has been unloaded to the youth. That I think this is part of the fact that, for instance, because I'm talking about Italy because one of the point of crisis, forthcoming crisis, is on the 4th of March with the Italian election, because the French and Dutch election and German elections are behind us, but the Italian election is there. And we know that 82% of the young people vote for the Five Stars movement, while the elders vote for Berlusconi. That is the situation, which makes everything very more complicated. Then you say the regional dimension. I think that there have been, in the relationship between central government and regional government, a lot of mistakes in many countries. There is, but I think that the principle of subsidiarity, the fact that the idea that at local level you spend better the money is not proven by evidence. This is why, on the contrary, we have seen that there is more waste and corruption at local level sometimes that at national or at EU level. So that's these are also all elements, but what you just touched upon, but I think it's very important. What is coming very strongly is the issue of identity. The people in the context of globalization, they need to have roots, and these roots, the issue of identity make explain so much why people are increasingly attached to their local roots. So that is not an explanation, but I think that the issues are enormous. But there is Jan Krastev, a Bulgarian sociologist that has published a book, After Europe, in which he said that, as a Central European, he said, the collapse of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and this of construction that seemed eternal collapsed by what a book called The Sleep Wanderers, that there was that people didn't realize that what could happen, that I've been born with this, I grew up with the idea of European federalism. And I thought that was an irreversible trajectory. Today, Sigmar Gabriel, for instance, said that it's not unthinkable to think of a disruption of Europe, and that is what makes me very nervous and very worried.
Thank you. Now, do I see any hands up or flags up? Or I do.
I'll start. I think there's many of us who want to say things. Marie-Hélène Caillol, from President of LEAP. Is that okay? Can I start?
European political strategy. So please go ahead and react to what's been said.
C'est parti. No, thank you very much for inviting us to this very interesting, timely, and needed discussion on the future of Europe. I'd like to start with this one of the many challenges that you highlighted, Anthony, the aging population. And here I'm going to be a bit sarcastic, saying that I read recently that, fortunately, let's say, life expectancy in Europe is going down. Is that something that we all agree on? It seems to be statistical. So is that supposed to be good news? Maybe it's going to solve that problem. But it really, I wanted to start on this because it's so emblematic of this crisis of progress that you mentioned, Ron. What progress? What are we progressing towards? Is progress reducing life expectancy today? I mean, there is a big questioning over so many assumptions of all our model. So we do have indeed a crisis of the future, a crisis of progress and of the future, which and it is now absolutely urgent to give Europe a future again. And when I say Europe, I would like to highlight also the Europeans, because it's the Europeans who like a future today, a collective future. And we have we made parallels with the fact that this lack of future is maybe one of the reasons why we have so many reminiscences of the past of Europe today. You mentioned the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today with the Visegrad Group and what's happening now with Austria, which is getting closer to this Visegrad Group, we have a reminiscence of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have in Spain, we have some reminiscences, of course, minor, but of the Spanish Civil War. We have some reminiscences in the Brexit of the Blocus Continental. We have things like that coming all over the place. And that's by lack of a future, that's true. So giving Europe and the Europeans a future again is essential. The problem we have is indeed in terms of governance, the fact that who has the power to implement any kind of future. We can debate endlessly, but how can we actually move forward again this crisis of progress again? And here we have today, indeed, lots of proposals lots of proposals on how to re-give power, take control of this European level that we created. And the far right, which are emerging, as we know, the radical movements and governments now that are emerging everywhere have a solution to that, which is strength. We at LEAP, in our tradition, and here in this room, of course, would like this power to be anchored in democratic legitimacy. That's, well, at LEAP, LEAP is a European, Paris-based European think tank, which has always been very concerned about the democratization of the European Union. And today, of course, we'd like to dig into the second option, democratization. We have an opportunity, indeed. We've had 10 years of crisis. We've had the Brexit. We have, you mentioned Trump also. We have lots of reasons now to see that the model, the previous model, is completely broken. So we have no other opportunity now than to start thinking about changing and implementing that change. So we have an opportunity today. since 2 years, and we see how much Europe today is really active. There's this EU 27 discussions on the future of Europe. There's this mobilization of civil society, etc. So we see that the debate is brewing, which is very positive somehow. But yet, indeed, how is it going to canalize into something constructive and not destructive? That's the problem. There's another positive thing, which is in terms of the capacity. We have an opportunity. We have in terms of capacity the fact that something resisted in the EU. It's not the EU, it's the Eurozone. The Eurozone, even though it's been going through very severe hardships, of course, in the past 8 years, finally resisted somehow well, but without the citizens. It is really the civil servants, the technocracy, the institutions who manage with difficulty and against somehow political dimension of Europe. The Bundestag was very much often against the Eurozone, what the Eurozone was trying to implement in terms of solution. It's been legitimately, by the way, criticized in terms of how the decision-making process occurred. But nevertheless, till today, we have a euro which resisted against all odds, against every anticipation, not ours, by the way. And today, we see that this Eurozone provides a very solid launchpad to re-energize the whole of the EU project. Let's not call it maybe the EU, but the whole of the European integration project. And we have Macron today. He's key into, he has made very strong proposals in terms of reforming the Eurozone. And now he's waiting for, indeed, Germany to organize their coalition in order to start a Franco-German engine to actually move fast on this Eurozone rebuilding, reform, to re-energize the whole of the European project. But we still are missing the citizens here. And here I'd like to say that the other opportunity that we have is the 2019, of course, European election, where we have a major challenge, which is to finally, for the first time in European history, have a trans-European election in 2019, which means somehow a trans-European debate borne by trans-European political parties. We have a few emerging. We have TM25, but we have the Green Party. We have En Marche, which is trying to move in that direction of building a trans-European movement. This is key, because this is the only way where the citizens can enter finally the game as European citizens and not as national citizens. So I'd like to say that we have a challenge in 2019 is to have a real trans-European election, and that this trans-European election is not what I call gray between pro-Europeans and anti-Europeans, with from white to black with all the gray nuances, but a colorful election where we really have green, red, white, blue, black options, a colorful election, and trans-European, of course. Just one last remark on the role of the media. We have today this, even if there are a few transnational, trans-European medias, mostly people get informed through their national media, and are these how can we make sure increased chances for these national media to be able to cover trans-European, this trans-European debate and not focus only on their on the national dimension of this trans-European debate, thus breaking this chance for the European citizens to move to this European level. That's the last challenge that we'd like to lay down on this table, and that's all for me now. Merci.
Would you like the European?
AEGEE. Can I start? Thank you.
Well,
Here
he is. He's going to summarize this discussion, and it will be made available. So could you say who you are and then speak? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Maria Ballesteros Melero, and I come from AEGEE, the European Students Forum, which is a European student organization that was born almost 33 years ago here in Paris, and that now is present in 42 countries in almost 200 cities. We, as a European movement, strive for a democratic, borderless, and integrated Europe that takes into account the participation of young people in the European project. So I would like to start by thank you all very much for inviting me, for inviting us to take part into this conversation because, well, I'm based in Brussels, and it's quite often that the future of Europe and youth issues are discussed, and many decisions are made without taking into account young people, without taking into account the actual people that are going to shape that future of Europe and that people that are going to be there. So thanks for that. I hope this practice becomes more common than it is now. And I would like also to highlight the role that the Erasmus program that just made its 30th anniversary last year in 2017 has in building this future of Europe. Why? Because the Erasmus program is more than an educational program. The Erasmus program is what makes possible to have a real European citizenship, what makes possible that us, my generation, we are the European generation, we are the Erasmus generation. So linking a little bit with a comment that Sergio made, we all need to have roots, and there's indeed an identity problem and an identity need. Well, some of us, thanks to this program, we can say that our identity is European. In my case, I can say that I'm Spanish. I did Erasmus in Brussels. Then I also lived in Italy, thanks to the European Voluntary Service. Right now, also thanks to the Erasmus program, in the end, I'm here in Paris, in France, sharing with you my experience. And it is because of that that we are able to have another vision of Europe that diverges from what has been done in the past and what I think it's needed for the future, to propose new solutions and to propose a new way of doing things, something different that has been done so far. So what this Erasmus generation is able to do is not to get stuck into the framework of national states, of the nation state. As another example, in AEGEE, we don't have a national level. We organize ourselves connecting Europe with the cities and the cities with Europe, being able like that to be more inclusive and to create a real European community. So we move forward the nation states to create a European identity and to build a real future of Europe. Besides what young people claim is to have a more sustainable, democratic, and participatory Europe. Sustainable, first of all, in terms of climate, also in terms of sustainable economy, which is something that concerns us quite a lot, because we are going to be the first generation for a lot of time that lives worse living conditions than the generation before. Democratization is needed, and to increase the participation of citizens, and in this case especially of youth and other groups that have not had a voice before in the European project and in the policy making, it's essential. And I would like to finish this short intervention with a quote that our founder, Franck Biancheri, made, which is that we have to occupy the future. We have to own the future and to be able to shape it, to be able to shape the policies and not to be mere service receivers for that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Incidentally, yes, I'll just make a remark and then you can come in. In this organization, we have a unit called Strategic Foresight. I wish they were here, actually, because here we're talking about strategic foresight. Just a remark about identity, because it seems to be clear that identity is very often territorially based. I mean, I'm still the young man from northwest England that I was. I went through the Great Depression. I used to queue up every Friday night for stale bread. My mother used to send me out for queue up for stale bread. So I can understand what it feels when a community, it's not only individuals who are stranded, but it's communities which are becoming stranded. And so we need some new concept of the state. And one of the things that's beginning to float up in the OECD discussions is, first of all, a polycentric society, a polycentric global system in which states are not the only actors. You are in the system, and sometimes you go, you vote, and you express your power through the vote, sometimes on the streets, and you might even revolt. There are several events of that kind around the world today. So a polycentric system in which states are empowering states, in other words, recognizing that there are other actors. The role of the state is to empower them. And that concept is beginning to be discussed, and it could make it possible to get at this question of the role of states. I mean, it's perfectly obvious, for example, in relation to climate. Look what's happening. The multinationals, some multinationals, local groups, young people, they're all acting. And the role of the state, and as it seemed clear at the Paris meeting, was to bring them into the effort by empowering them. Okay, now that was very interesting, and no doubt we will have some comments. Did somebody else for the floor? Yes. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Adrien, and I'm working with the LEAP 2. I would like to come back on the call of the 15,000 scientists, which alerted us to the dangers due to the way we live on the Earth. So according to them, due to mass production, the Earth is losing its natural resources and is less and less able to renew it. So it creates uncertainty on its future and calls us to answer to a question, maybe a provocative one, but how can you exchange tomorrow without resources to produce? So needless to say that we might change positively our perception of economy and stop seeing environmental matters as a tragic problem. Our priority, is to suggest positive means of action and give to environmental issue a new dimension within the European institution. And I have the conviction that environment must be considered as the main regulator of the exchanges of tomorrow. And for this innovative idea to lead the exchange in the single market, we shall give a political power to an innovative action to institutions such as the European Bank of Investment. Currently, the European Bank of Investment, such as the central bank, are stuck in their status of independency because it's independent from democratic decision. And we can't give colors, as Marianne says, to the decision-making process by democratization. And sharing decision with the European Parliament can be another idea too. The politicization of the institutional process can allow more investment and creative ideas in the environmental fields. And the first innovation shall be for ideas. Then, if we see as an innovation the regulation of economy by the environmental stakes, Europe in the future will be at the cutting edge of the economical innovation, a positive and inventing democratic and ecologic model. So thanks to the enlargement of this possible future political decision by democratization, environment can be what Europe needs to democratize itself around a transversal idea bringing citizens together, an idea which will be in debate in 2019 and which can be like our idea to bring together against the Europe of far right, for example. And to create Europe of the future, we must accept that environment and economy will be complementary, not only that environment will act as a regulation. That's a necessary revolution if you want to discuss economy again in the future. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. In response to that, we have several contributions here, but I just want to make... Pardon?
John and Andrew.
Yes, quite. But I just want to mention that it may interest you. The Club of Rome was the first to intervene on that question. And the Club of Rome was invented in the OECD by my director of the time, Alex King. But the economists fought him on that. And they won. They won at the time of the oil shocks crisis. And that question is now coming back. The Secretary General has recently set up a group where a certain number of OECD officials, which he has hand-chosen, and the International Association of Systems Analysts, because the idea is that we're dealing with a complex system. So that theme is coming up. I might say that the idea that I'm plugging is that your generation and already the global system has to reconcile nature, the economy, and society. And that means a radical shift in the way we define the economy. Well, having said that, I will throw the ball to John Martin, who is a former director. He was recruited by me on the social side of the house, which we created as a counterweight to the economists. And then he migrated to the economists' side of the house, and he came back. So he's a good man to comment on these things. Okay, John.
Thank you, Ron. I wanted to put a question to both Sergio and Tony. When you look at the history of the European venture, most of the achievements were driven by an axis between France and Germany, when we look at the history of it, at a time when there seemed to be some balance between these two leading countries in the European Union. But some of the issues that you have both touched on reflect the fact that the French-German couple has changed balance completely. The power within Europe, within that couple, has shifted inexorably to Germany. And there is no longer, in some sense, this balancing act, as it were. Now, we know that President Macron recently has tried to give some renewed impetus and vision. But if we look at it from a pragmatic point of view, the economic weight of Germany and its power in that sphere is so much greater than France, or what France can ever achieve. So what, in a sense, if that was the key motor of progress in the past, what is going to take its place? Some people have argued that, for example, we should create, throw, in a sense, have two-zone currency zone. A Deutschmark, an old Deutschmark system on the one hand, and then the soft Franco-Lira, as it were, a zone on the other. That doesn't seem very palatable to me, but it has the merit, at least, of posing that dilemma very clearly. It's simply not clear to me, either Sergio or Tony, how you harness this vision of a reformed Europe to a world in which Germany is the dominant country in the 27 on the economy ground, not so much necessarily perhaps on the political or world stage. But still, that particular dynamic has not been replaced. And ideas that you can form other coalitions, in a sense, to drive it forward seem to me to be very, very shaky indeed. And I'd be interested to hear your views on that. My second point is to Tony. Tony would like to get rid of the nation state. But actually, I would argue that the events of the recent times that he alluded to demonstrate just how strongly the sense of nationality and nationalism and nation states are. And we have, many commentators and writers have downplayed that to their peril and ignored the fact that much of what we call the geography of discontent is also tied up with this question of our image of the nation state and what nationality means. And unless Europe can somehow or other create a sensible symbiosis between nationalism in its best form and the notion of adherence to European ideals, then I fear that much of the talk about reform is just hot air. And we might yet sleepwalk, to use Sergio's point, towards the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and that August of 1914. That was, as it were, the catalyst for much of this trouble.
John, what do you think of the idea of the empowering state, since you've...
Well, I mean, it's a slogan for the moment. I would want to see what does it mean in practice. I mean, what is, there are terms like the enabling state, the empowering state, but what does that mean in practice for citizens? What does that mean in terms of the balance of power between central, local, regional, and so forth? How does that deal with some of the big challenges that have been mentioned around this table, such as aging populations, the environment, the internexus between the environment and the economy, and so forth? So as I say, a slogan is a slogan, but we need to see what the reality and what it would mean in practice. At least that's my view anyway, Ron.
Well, you saw a good example of it in the recent meeting on the environment, on the climate. A brilliant example of what it means in practice. People are acting on the problem of the environment across the world. There are all sorts of experiments going on. The multinationals are moving in on it. The business community, and in this house we have the group on responsible business conduct. So there's a very good example there. It's not so much pie in the sky, I think, as you seem to think. Andrew, we'll have another skeptic here, I think, but never mind. Andrew.
No, actually, I like that optimistic tilt you've just given, because basically I'm going to say some rather pessimistic things. I don't know whether they're skeptical, maybe they're realistic. But, and first of all, thanks very much for organising this. It's very good to have the younger people together with the older people. They're not so many middle-aged people, although I'd like to think I'm middle-aged, but I was kicked out of the OECD some time ago, so I guess I'm old now. In any case, I'm
mature, Andrew.
Mature, thank you. I am pessimistic because what I see in practice is actually sort of disintegration going on in Europe. And it's not just Brexit, and it's not just Poland and Hungary and what's happening there, and Austria was mentioned, and Spain and Catalonia and Scotland maybe wanting independence and so on. It's the whole sort of mood and spirit, and it's not made any better by people like Trump, of course, across the other side of the pond. And it's dangerous. It's very, very dangerous, and it's totally against the sort of things that this organisation stands for, and that these youth organisations stand for as well. So the question is, well, how do you stop the rot? I mean, what does one do to try to turn things around? And I'm afraid to say that I don't think more centralisation is what's going to stop the rot, as it were, because I think there's a lot of disaffection with attempts at centralization. And I actually think the European Union is actually a wonderful organization, but I don't think it actually sells itself very well. So I think that there will be resistance to more centralization. And it may be that France and Germany at the top, if a coalition can be formed, can sort of try to push things along to get things going a little bit better, at least in the core of Europe. But I am a bit, indeed, skeptical about that. So, I mean, if that's the case, what does one do? Well, I think actually one has to accept that centralization may be a difficult game to play, and that one has to accept that a multi-speed Europe is actually what's going to happen. And then I think you have to posit your policies and your attempts to get people together to talk about these things that John was talking about, adherence to European ideals. I think you have to do it in a different sort of fora, more spread out, multi-speed, a differentiated set of institutions. So, I mean, that's how I see it. I would just say that life expectancy in Europe, I don't think is going down. In the United States, it is. It has been in Russia, but I don't think it is in Europe. And we have some of the world experts on this here. But so you might have read it, but there's a lot of false news around. So I would check your references. Anyway, I'm sorry to be rather pessimistic, but that's basically how I see the situation.
Well, we know that economics is said to be the dismal science, don't we?
That's true, but don't forget, I mean, the economies are actually doing rather better at the moment. It might be that economists are dismal people, but that's because they're always worried about the risks in the situation.
Economists, mainly macroeconomists, because they have a conceptual framework based on ideas about what makes people tick, and basically it's a human science. So let's not despair. We can even get them to get into this discussion, and it's beginning to happen, I think, in this institution. Now, we have...
Pedro from Brazil.
This is...
Pedro.
Can you hear me? My name is Pedro. I'm from Brazil. So I'm not from a member country of the OCDE, but an observer country. And I'm almost an economist. I have been studying to become a diplomat. So I would like to pose a question in order to answer something that I think that I cannot find the answer in Brazil from our media and sometimes from our researchers. So that's a great opportunity to be here and to pose a question almost directly to the source. And what I would like to first introduce, then ask, is how you understand in Brazil how the standard discussion about the European Union and its future. The most spread understanding is that, well, since 2008 to 2008 crisis, the growth in Asia and the new protectionist cycle has outsourced a lot of production from Europe to other countries, and that posed new problems to the European Union. And the current strategy that we discuss in Brazil that is being made in Europe is how can we concentrate research and development, core activities in the European Union in order to face this outsourcing process. So when I think about that, I would also like to introduce and pose a question to you. How can austerity play a role that's not comprehended within that discussion? So if we discuss like that, like the standard way, okay, the protectionism is the greatest problem. We must concentrate core activities. But how can the austerity change the national budget, the European Union budget? So we were discussing Erasmus program, which is really interesting. So I imagine, okay, if in the future the budget of programs such as Erasmus or other programs of integration is going to decrease, it would be mainly related to austerity policies. But shouldn't it be the time to increase the budget for the integration of the European Union within a situation where the austerity and the reduction of budget is current? So if in the future we could have an Erasmus program for the high school students that are not part of the university centers that are already somehow an elite, and that could play a different role. So if you could please discuss how can we understand the austerity related to the discussion that sometimes in Brazil it's not posed like that. So thank you very much.
So who's that question for? It could be...
Well, to whom it concerned, I don't know who would prefer to discuss that subject.
No, inevitably, Ron, I want to back into something that's already been, we've already gotten on the table, not quite this question on budgets. It was provoked by the references to the collapse of the Austria-Hungary Empire. We're celebrating anniversaries, lots of them this year and next year. Well, one of the problems that was posed by the vacuum in the creation of new states was how to protect human rights and minority rights in these multi-ethnic countries that were newly created in Central and Eastern Europe. And a division was made in 1919 between the great powers, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, and the other new countries, and to say the great powers can do what they want, but they are also going to tell these other newly independent sovereign countries what they can do and what they cannot do. And that was greatly resented. It didn't work as fascists gained power, and the minorities who had rights found that they couldn't enforce those rights. And so after, it takes a while to get progress. But 1948, and this is another 8-year, at the end of this December 10th, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in the Palais de Chaillot, just a kilometer from here. And at the same time, in Europe, there was a European Court of Human Rights that was created. And this is still unique because every citizen in a country that is signatory has the right to appeal to the court for the protection of his rights directly. And no state can claim that it is so sovereign that it cannot be appealed against. American citizens don't have this right in the United States at all. They cannot sue the federal government at all. They have to be the victims of something. It has to go through the courts and so on and so forth. But Europeans can appeal directly to this court. And this is, I think, part of the core concept of Europe, is the fundamental dignity of the individual. Now, whether the individual sees himself subordinated to the nation state or to Europe, it is the integrity of the individual that Europe protects. And this is why we're adding rule of law increasingly to the crises of Europe. But the law is pretty strong. And I think the real test of the future of Europe will be this question of judicial power and judicial rights and the enforceability of judgments made outside a country in a country. The enforceability. And that's going to be key in this whole Brexit business, is the enforceability of a foreign court into another territory.
Thanks very much. I sat myself down between youth organisations here as I was taking Anthony's suggestion of Forever Young sort of to heart before he actually said it. So a new retiree, but formally responsible for the TUAC here, the Trade Union Advisory Committee. I just had one comment and then one suggestion. The comment came out, I mean, a lot of very interesting things have been said, but I was involved sort of personally a bit in the anti-Brexit campaign as part of the Labour Party in the UK campaign for Remain and Labour In. So I found myself talking to quite a lot of activists, in the Labour heartlands and elsewhere, in the run-up to Brexit, and making various speeches which obviously had zero effect in terms of against Brexit. But there were a couple of senses. One I had from that was that, and I think it's implicit in what you've all been saying from the top table there a bit, that people were expressing a sense of something going wrong with their societies, not just something going wrong with Europe. So it was an opportunity being given to people to kick what they saw as the elite across the shins, whether it's because of unemployment, stagnant wages, rising inequality, immigration, a whole series of things they felt that elites were out of touch with them. And a very similar effect in terms of what came through with the Trump election in the states that you referred to, Ron, in the US. So I think in terms of trying to untangle that, the argument that I and other colleagues were trying to put forward is Europe is a solution to many of those issues, and what's been achieved in certain aspects of the social dimension in Europe is a solution and shouldn't be seen as the target. That essentially failed, but what actually won on the Brexit campaign was this notion of take back control. So you're talking about slogans, but that very sharp notion of take back control from a bunch of, a part of the elite, which in a very, in my mind, sort of, indespicable a way of just sort of turning the process for their own gains to a turn in favour of Brexit, were actually very effective in dealing with it. Nobody's put the issue on the table here that, Brexit still hasn't happened. And though it is still, almost nobody would dare, I think in a UK political context, raise the issue of another referendum or actually not happening, apart from Tony Blair, which is not helping the case. But I still think when it eventually goes to Parliament, the third choice of things staying as they are may still be there. I just leave that there because it does affect some of the strategic arguments. But I think the issue of how you address the same questions about the Labour heartlands, the swing states in the US, National Front voters in France feeling essentially inequality, dispossession, economic deprivation was the target, not necessarily about the EU, needs to be fed back into thinking around the issues. The other suggestion, I agree with what John was saying about the nation state. If you look at recent events, it seems, the one thing that violence may be used about is the question of the risk of secession. And there haven't been many examples of secession in the past without wars. And the extent to which the clampdown on what happened in Catalonia was responded to with, cases of treason still strikes me, maybe we underestimate sometimes this notion that sort of you can move away from nation states pretty easily and deal with the consequence. I just leave that comment. But I think what's perhaps been missing from the discussion we've had today and is missing in this notion of how you reform the EU is, what is the narrative about the future which actually gives people hope again? Because I think that somehow, I don't disagree with almost anything that's been said by Sergio, by Anthony or others on, what are some of the questions of reform, nuts and bolts, different concentric circles. But how do you try to build that narrative now? Obviously, Ron, you were one of the few people here who still remember very well the Second World War. But I remember, Helmut Kohl once saying to us, we had a group of trade unionists meeting with him before one of the summits, he said, our problem today is people don't remember the Second World War. But that was a driving force of the narrative about European Union, which lasted for a long time. The narrative then, to some extent, was, okay, Europe, you can pool sovereignty in a globalized world, you can make sure that some of the things you look to the nation state to deliver can be actually delivered through European integration and unity. And that seems to evaporate. And I think that's what's giving us this pessimism now, for some good reasons and some bad reasons. But if we can't, I think, somehow rebuild that narrative in a very constructive way, then the pessimism will win.
If I may, very briefly, how about, instead of just one narrative, a set of narratives and a debate around them? Isn't that the way?
Maybe let 1,000 narratives bloom, maybe.
No, not 1,000, that's too many.
Everybody's talking about narratives these days. The OECD is trying to develop a new narrative, and certainly we need a message of hope. I think that message of hope is that Europe, and it's linked to what you said, Europe is essentially an experiment in humanism. It's an expression of the Enlightenment, and that's what the message that has to be got across. Incidentally, the OECD is a funny organization because it's already gone a big part of the way by saying that what it's all about is better lives. And what could be more humanistic than better lives?
That's Anthony.
Pardon?
That's Anthony who developed that.
Did you develop that, Anthony? Bravo.
It was a collective effort.
Yeah. But the only problem about that is that it's largely an individualist concept. It's making people happy. It's delivering well-being. But what is the common project? That's the issue, and that's the issue facing Europe. Now, Sergio, can't you, this question from our Brazilian colleague was about the EU budget.
Yeah.
And the way the austerity policies affect the capacity of the European Union to invest in the new trajectories, innovation. Could you say something about that?
Well, it's, the issue of austerity is a tricky one because there is an Italian economist who just published a book as austerity is positive for growth because she documents that all the countries that, like Ireland, that have reduced their public spending have had, over the last 5 years, a growth rate 2, 3, 4 times higher than the countries that continue to spend more than they could afford. So that's, I think that the question is not so much spending more or less, but spending better. That is the challenge. This is why also in the revision of the EU budget, there is a selection. There should be decided what actually makes the difference, what is actually brings value added and what doesn't. And that is spending reviews are going on all over the place. And I think that's, that is the way we have to address the issue. But John Martin posed a question concerning the Franco-German engine. And I think that is a real problem because one of the goals of the European Union is the convergence of the economies. But since 2003, France has been accumulating trade deficit in the range between 50 and 70 billion euros annually, and Germany has been accumulating trade surplus in the range of 150 to 160 billion euros. And there has been a call by Christine Lagarde when he was Minister of Finance and as Director of the IMF for Germany to reduce its, to be less competitive, to be, which I don't think it's the right response. I think that the right response is what Macron tries to do, is to make France more effective. Because take youth unemployment. This is not a problem in Germany, nor in Netherlands, nor in Denmark, nor in Austria, nor in the German world. It's a problem on in the rest of Europe. So I think that the vocational training, the mechanism to implement the skill strategy that the OECD has been. You, John, I remember that you were telling to the French government that they were wasting 32 billion euros annually for a vocational training that was totally ineffective. I think that is the crux. That is where the issue is, and the adjustment must be made if you want France to regain, because Germany is, as has been put by an analyst on foreign affairs, it's a reluctant hegemon. But France has to make those structural reforms that you yourself and the organization, the OECD, has been encouraging France for many years to make. I think that that is in that direction.
Yeah. Secondly, don't you think that Germany has a problem of public investment?
Oh, there you are.
Push the button.
Yeah. I'll just make a remark on that, and then Anthony, I think it's time you could make a comment on various things that are said. On this question, there is now a great educational divide. It is a divide between those who get access to higher education and those who don't. And never, once they take the option for apprenticeship, their capacity for social mobility is nil, relatively nil. The result is that all young people want to get a higher education, and the OECD says that's the way you get access to better income and better position. Somehow or other, this policy for lifelong learning has to incorporate a redistributive aspect. People have to have a second chance. And that's one of the big problems of the day. I mention it because Jacques Delors, of course, was the initiator of the concept of education permanente, formation permanente. And I'm sure you'd be pleased to know that the OECD, having for a long time said equality comes from the school and even early childhood education, is now beginning to propose that lifelong learning be redistributive. There's a report just out yesterday, and I think you'd be pleased to know that. Now, I think we have to listen to, is it this lady? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Marianne, Ranke-Cormier, so I'm French, German, and Austrian also. I am working with Marie-Hélène Caillol, and I am the Vice President of the Association des Amis de Franck Biancheri, and thank you to have spoken about him at the beginning of this meeting, and thank you for the invitation. And And there are so many food, so there's so many food for thought that it's very interesting. I want to come back on what you said, Sergio, about federalism, that you grew up with the idea, with the vision that federalism will become the system to rule the European Union. And because this shows that with the years, there's only one vision is not sufficient to change a situation, to evolve, to make a situation evolving in the time. One vision, it's like an imperialist vision. And so I come back on the book we just published about Europe, a community or an empire. So it was the last book Franck Biancheri wrote 30 years ago, no, 20 years ago. Okay. Because Europe is not only one people. Europe is composed by different people. We can become European citizens. We can have the European citizenship. But I don't think we can move with all the different histories and cultures and narratives we are all bringing, all the people all the European people are bringing to build this system, that we cannot have only one people, continental people. For me, it's not possible. You talk about Brexit. Brexit was to take the control back. Why didn't the European Union not answer to the citizens of Europe? Take the control, not take the control back, but take the control on European decision process. And this is democratization. This is the political issue of the European Union today, to give the people the control, and not through national political bodies, national political parties, but really through trans-European political actors who are speaking for the European citizens on different topics. They are, as you said, environment, and they are pillars of European politics. And these pillars need to be discussed by the European people together, by the European citizens together. And we have now the issue of 2019, and thank you, Sergio, to say that we don't need to change the treaties. Thank you for that, because this is the main point we're discussing actually inside the project we launched in last July, which is called CitizensRoute, which has for objective to gather together different political movements, political parties inside on European level to make them emerge, to have, to create, to constitute, to engage on a trans-European political debate, not on national levels, but on really trans-European ones. We have the tools for that. As Marie has said, since 30 years, Erasmus is a program which is building these European citizens, which is bringing the young people to the conscience that they are European citizens. And this was also one of the objectives of Erasmus. It was not only a tool for university exchanges. It was also supported by AEGEE and Franck Biancheri at that time as a political program in order to build European citizenship. So we have the tools. The other tools are the technologies. You are speaking all about the new technologies. Open wide internet, we have the forums, we have the different platforms who are enabling people. They are exchanging actually on the global wide stage. So why not on the trans-European one? They are also discussing. And you are right, there is the difference. We need the elites, but we need also to connect to the normal people. These people inside the nation states are choosing what we call populist or extremist political parties. Conservative, I would say conservative. Why conservative? Because there is this pyramid of age also. Sorry. I am becoming a senior too. I am still a senior. And that's right. As senior, we are becoming more and more conservative. We are more and more for the future, yes. Fear for the future, yes, that's right. So this is really the challenge this year for the European Union, for the elites, for the political movements, for the political structures, for the national ones, for the European ones, to give the people, the European citizens, a chance to really take control on a democratic way. Occupy the future. And to decide about their future. Thank you.
So we're got a few minutes, so I will ask Anthony and Sergio to respond. I'd just like to say one thing to you. You're right, the new methods of communication, the internet, social media, are a vehicle of power. I mean, you only say again, the recent debate about equality for women and the role of women and all that. Fantastic. It was the social media that imposed a change. So that's a very important point, and it's a very important point for exercising youth power. This seminar, there'll be a video. Well, you can use it on your networks. Might be a useful thing for you to do, and it will mean that this seminar has been useful. So, Anthony, you made a very interesting point about values. I think that's fundamental. We need a shift in values. We need to state it. It's more than a question of human rights. It's the question that we have a common humanity. It's the question that there has to be social diversity. People are attached to their territories. We don't want to see a single European culture. It's a question of the deconcentration of power. The world is seeing a deconcentration of power, even if some of the historical civilizations are seeking to return to the power they had. They can't all do it. They're going to have to get together. Otherwise, it's conflict and war. And we need an equitable distribution of the fruits of progress within nation states and between them. And of course, that's happening, but it needs to be recognized and organized. So that's my little last ploy. But Anthony, will you now, and then Sergio, and that'll be it. Thank you very much.
Super interesting to I think listen to all of the elements that have been brought forward, and there are many things that come into my mind on the back of what I've heard. Marianne. I'm talking to the young lady from Spain. Maria. I thought it was Maria. Okay. Suggestion from what I heard from you. I'm hearing you talk about cities. I'm wondering if you can go beyond cities. If you can go beyond cities to towns and villages. I'll tell you why. Because we spend so much of our time connecting between metropolises and cities, and we're all very international. And it's a bugbear I have here. I ask colleagues, how often do they venture beyond what the term in this organization is the capital? It's hardwired into this organization, some of the language, the capital. What does that come from? You're even hardwired into a room. What do you see on my right-hand side? What are the nameplates that you see? They're all in black, right? Yeah. Now, I don't want to get rid of the nation state. I've lived a life coming up to 50, actually, so it's an interesting moment for me with 68. And through that period of time, I've had my experiences. You've had your experiences, your Erasmus generation full on. I didn't know about Erasmus. I did my own Erasmus, and I came here to Paris to study. And I remember at the time, this connects me a little bit into what John was saying about the Franco-German motor, which is a really interesting question. At that time, I did a thesis at Sciences Po, together with two other fellow students. One was German and one was French. And what we posited was that how could we move from the Franco-German to the Franco-German British? And that was in 1990. Fast forward to 2018. 28 years, and we are talking the language of that time. So we're, the reliance on the Franco-German motor. Now, I'm not looking here to somehow dismiss realpolitik and it's all about the countries and the power of Germany and the power of... Okay. There was a time when some of these entities didn't exist. We had city-states, and we had other things. In human history, you've had a long time in human history. First thing to have in mind is that the European Union is a total exception in human history. The OECD is a total exception in human history. The United Nations, World Bank, all of these are total exceptions in human history. I would not like to see those entities necessarily disappear or to be got rid of. But what I'm wondering is the degree to which the psychology around the nation state, which is often hijacked by people who don't know the difference between healthy patriotism and nasty nationalism. So the people who right now may not understand or may not even have cared whether they may be sowing the seeds for what, again, when I grew up as a kid, every single news bulletin, terrorism in Northern Ireland. So the equivalent here is ISIS now. Every single news bulletin. And to get to a point where nobody was blowing anybody up or killing anybody anymore in Northern Ireland and in the island of Ireland, and the degree to which the European Union played a very subtle dilution of tension and created this space within which it didn't really matter so much anymore. And Brexit is a process that is showing this up. And I remember a conversation with one of John Evans's members, a female trade union leader, Frances O'Grady, whose name, it's an Irish name, she leads the British trade union movement. And she was in with the powers that be before the referendum to say, watch it, be very careful what you do, because you will be messing not just with the workers' interests and rights, but with what was happening in a space like that. And I think that's where I find this discomfort with the people sometimes who hide behind the nation state and hide behind the national interest and hide behind these things and say that they represent the people. I'll commend those of you who are on Twitter, and if you're not, get on it. Professor Green, go and watch an interview that was done of him on Channel 4 News recently. And there's a point where he says, this is a guy who represents the communities of people left behind. It's essentially, demographically, people who were deemed to be the majority. White, working class. He comes from that origin. And there's a point where he says it's incredible how these people, and he was referring to far-right groups in Britain, were waving the Union Jack. He said, it's incredible, these people are waving those flags. And actually, what did that state do for them? Now, this takes you back to sort of echoes of the First World War and things like that. I won't take it as far as all of that. But it's those elements. How do you keep that healthiness? But also, I think that the European Union has been unbelievably successful in that coexistence of being different identities. So I used to work for a gentleman called Pascal Lamine. I remember talking a lot to him, and then we would talk to many other people, and what were we going to say? And people often asked him, well, what's your loyalty? And he said, look, I've got a French shirt on, and on top of that shirt, I have a European shirt on. So you can have multiple identities. I have multiple identities. We all have multiple identities. We know that. Dig down, we all have those multiple identities. But there is a point where maybe people will feel, because they're fearful, anxious, and all of the things that John touched upon in terms of the the elements that breed this discontent, where people go tribal. And it's tribalism. And the tribalism starts getting you into more dangerous spaces. So I don't know how to answer the question about the Franco-German motor, other than to say that certainly in the world as it was, and that motor stopped working when Jacques Chirac became the president of France in 1995, and I remember it well. I think I joined the European Commission in 1995. That motor stalled the day Jacques Chirac walked into the Élysée, for the purposes of the European Union and as things went forward. The European Union has carried on. Of course, it enlarges. How the hell can you keep something going on the basis of two countries, however big they may be and however important in its origin with the Second World War and coal and steel and everything? Can you keep something going where your narrative to people who are joining from Central and Eastern Europe or from Malta or from Austria or from Sweden and say, well, it's all about the French and the Germans. You know, the French and the Germans cook it all up and then we all follow suit. Well, if I were anybody else, I would say that's a problem. And I was in the institutions when we were working through this and going, well, that's not going to work. There's got to be enough in there for everybody. And then the ones who were on the extremes, that's why qualified majority was invented. It was actually to get people to be sensible. You want to be on the extreme, but you're out of the game. And I remember a direct example. We negotiated something called Everything But Arms, which was to liberalize all imports to the European Union from the least developed countries, the 50 least developed countries in the world. And we got to a point where everyone agreed on everything except for 3 products: sugar, rice, and bananas. And I had people contacting me. At the time, we were being gold medals for protectionism for the EU, Oxfam. And I remember speaking to the guys and girls at Oxfam and saying, do you want to really help us? Then there's a job you've got to do, because there are 3 countries, nation states, whose prime ministers are going out there in 2 cases saying they really care about developing countries. One is Tony Blair and the other one is Gerhard Schröder. The third is Jacques Chirac. And to give Jacques Chirac credit, he was straight down the line all the way. He said, I don't give a damn for anybody other than France and French dependencies that produce bananas, that produce sugar. But he was straight down the line. Tony Blair wasn't, and nor was Gerhard Schröder. But the pressure had to be applied by the NGOs domestically to say, hang on, you're saying one thing in public, and then you're meeting Sud Zucker and you're meeting Tate and Lyle on the other. And so I think these dynamics that we can see at play, and sometimes when people present things in a certain way, in a nation-state way, I do think on many levels that it is superseded. I think that the challenges that we have before us, many of which we deliberate on at the OECD, we know that there aren't solutions that are just national. We know this. It's in the hard wiring. And is there a moment where we can be more honest about that? Not somehow to say that the nation-state has no role, but to posit where is it best to do certain things, and how are we going to deliver on some of the solutions that we might need. I think a word that Ron may be grasping for is we need to move from redistributive to pre-distributive. So if you want inclusive growth, that probably means that you need to be thinking in terms of pre-distribution. And how could the European Union grasp a concept like that and be able to actually render it tangible, which is a very important element. Maybe the OECD can help with it. I don't see a lot of centralization, and Andrew talked about more centralization. I think probably where the centralization is being called for is the completion of structures that are coherent with a monetary union, structures that were never put in place. So, for example, the fire escape in a building. You could argue that the harmonization, progressive harmonization of tax within a currency union is a good idea. Norman Lamont vetoed that in the early 1990s, the principle, even though Britain was never going to be inside the Eurozone, because he thought it was a slippery slope. I do wonder, obviously the dynamics have changed a lot now, but not that I wish it, John, but with Brexit, do you have less excuses then to say, well, there are people who are sort of stopping certain things happening? Because the multi-speed element may well come to pass. One of the actors that stopped multi-speed was the United Kingdom, because it didn't want anything to go forward with that was outside its purview and its control. Multi-speed may be a more natural flow of things. On the final thing, comment is maybe relates a little bit to what has occurred recently in certain quarters, and I guard very much against romanticism when people equate, say, what's happening and what's happened in recent years in Catalonia with the civil war or in other things, because it's massively different. Spain, I think everyone objectively would say, is one of the great successes of democratic transition. And when we talk about narratives, the narrative for Spain of the European Union, which is a very different one to the United Kingdom. Remember, the United Kingdom joined when it had no choice. It joined in 1973 after the oil crisis, when it had gone to the IMF, I think. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. And it was in the last sort of last saloon. And at that point, it's joining. It's like, well, we have no choice anymore. We can't do it ourselves anymore. That was a narrative that never left many people, generationally. And you contrast that with Spain, which is seeking an imprimatur, international imprimatur for its market economy, but in particular for its transition to democracy. And then you see how things progress subsequently. I say that because that's my own life experience, and as I observe and see things, I think it's also very dangerous sometimes when people think that they hark back to images and romanticism, and they also sort of see certain things. I have no truck with tough policing, but I've been in Paris for 10 years. I used to go to football stadia in Britain in the 80s, and I can tell you I saw a lot tougher stuff here or there than I saw on television around Catalonia.
Thank you very much. Sergio, you've got the final say. Before Nick Vanston has left, and he's going to produce a summary. God help him. It was a complicated discussion, but we will have it. Sergio, you've got the final word.
Well, a great deal of anti-Europeism has been fed by the present political leadership in Europe, because I've seen over the years, whenever there was something nasty, that politicians were saying it's the fault of Europe. Pro-Europe politicians were saying it's the fault of you. It's not me, it's Europe. And that day after year has changed the mood and has fed this anti-Europe. I think that Europe has not the greatest gift of Europe. Not only peace, but also democracy. And democracy today is even more in danger than peace. This anti-Europe movement, these sovereignist movements, they have been defeated in France last year with a new elan, a new spirit, and what I take from as a token of hope is what Marie-Hélène said, that in view of the next European Parliament election, new transnational political parties could emerge. They will be anti-Europeans, but hopefully new, renewed, different political parties like En Marche could eventually restore the hope and a vision for a Europe that gives new chances to the future generations. And with that, I will leave it.
Thank you to all of you, and especially to our friends at that end of the table, and we look forward to seeing you again. The next meeting will be on capitalism. Okay.
Coming back.